Hey folks, Eddie from Brain Pulp TV. It is April 21st, 2018, the first day of the pre-release for the newest set from Magic the Gathering, Dominaria. Now, whenever a new set comes out, we do open some product here on the channel. This is no exception. We have both of the Planeswalker decks to open up, and we're going to kick this video off by opening up the Teferi Planeswalker deck. That's Teferi Timebender. Now, I believe that is how you pronounce his name, Teferi. If not, I'm sure someone will let me know in the comments section below. But we're going to crack this open. I'm going to do this just slightly different than I've done these Planeswalker deck openings in the past. In the past, I basically just sort of opened up the deck itself, gone through and shown you the cards that are inside the deck. This time, I'm going to spend just a bit more time talking about some of the cards and how the deck itself is seemingly built to run. So this should give some of you who are new players, and this is really what this product typically is sort of targeted towards new players. If you're wondering not just what's in the deck, but sort of the strategy behind it and how maybe you can implement it while you're playing an opponent, I will sort of go into more detail and explain that along the way. So when I open up the deck, I'm actually going to show you the cards in not the exact order that they're packed in the deck, but in an order that's going to be makes it easier for me to explain to you what exactly this deck is supposed to do. Oh, and one last thing before I open this up. If you're not familiar with what the Planeswalker decks are, they are 60 card standard legal decks, which contain cards just from the current expansion. Now, if this is a Planeswalker deck from a second expansion, like Rivals of Ixalan was a second expansion from Ixalan, then these would also contain cards from that set as well too. But with being Dominaria, this is a standalone set so far, unless they have a sequel to it. And the cards in the Planeswalker decks are just going to have cards from Dominaria in them. So these are not exceedingly powerful decks. They're not powerful really in any way. If you're looking for some sort of power behind a pre-constructed standard deck, the Challenger decks, which recently came out, are probably the product you would most want to lean towards. But if you just want to have like a fun deck, which you can just pick up and immediately start playing against a friend, then this is kind of an interesting set because not only does it come with an exclusive Planeswalker, as you can see on the front here, there are also 3 other cards in this deck which are exclusive to these decks, as well as a dual land, which, while not exclusive to this deck, you're not going to be able to find that dual land in regular packs of Dominaria. So that pretty much covers the basics. We are going to be pitting this against the new Chandra deck from Dominaria on a upcoming episode of the Mana Cave where we play live Paper Magic. However, that is going to be sometime later in the week. For now, let's crack this sucker open and we can see what's inside. Okay, here we go. Alrighty, so here we have the Planeswalker, which I'm going to try to very gently remove from the packaging and not bend it, though it is a foil, so that may happen all on its own. I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to talk more about him in just a second, but I'm going to show you what else is inside one of these Planeswalker decks. We got the plastic packaging, which I'll discard here. Now, these do come with their own little cardboard deck boxes, which are wide enough to fit sleeved cards. Now, some folks have apparently received some of these which they couldn't fit sleeved cards into, and that, I'm guessing, is some sort of printing defect because I've never had an issue putting sleeved cards into these particular boxes. So inside the box here, and I'll set this aside, you can see the artwork and you can also see his name on the side and the Planeswalker symbol on the other side there. I'm going to set the box over here. So you have the deck itself sealed up in a nice little brick, and you also get 2 packs of whatever the newest expansion is, in this case, Dominaria. So I'm going to be opening these up at the end of this video. I'm going to set these aside for now. You also have a little information foldout. Now, in the past, they put the deck lists from these Planeswalker decks on here, and they've since stopped doing that, and this is no exception to that. So they go over some of the mechanics from this particular deck, but they do not have a deck list here, which is unfortunate, but it seems to be following the trend that they set a few Planeswalker decks ago. And of course, you get the quick reference card here, which is good for new players. And also, I got to admit, I found it handy a couple times when there's been a couple of questions about ordering when we've done the Mana Cave and what happens on what turn and when, specifically usually around the untap step and the draw step and so on. But yes, this is another thing that comes with it, which is very, very useful for new or returning players. I'm just going to set all this aside, though, with the exception of the cards. And let's talk about the Planeswalker, but before I do that, we're going to zoom in so you guys can have a bit of a better look at both him and the rest of the deck. Okay, so here we go. We have Teferi, Timebender. He is a 6-drop for a white and a blue. Will get you a 5 loyalty legendary Planeswalker Teferi. His +2 ability is untap up to 1 target artifact or creature. His -3 is you gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. And his -9 is take an extra turn after this one. Now, this follows suit with most of the Planeswalkers that you will find in these Planeswalker decks. Actually, I think it's pretty much safe to say all of them, where he's a bit overcosted, but he does have useful abilities. So his -3, for example, is with a lot of the Planeswalkers, you want them to have a useful ability the second they hit the board. You don't want anything to be too conditional. You don't want it to be only useful if you already have creatures or only useful if your opponent has creatures. So in this case, with his abilities, the first one is pretty much dependent on what's happening with the board, but his -3 ability will help you immediately. So it is very useful, especially if you're looking for some sort of answer or solution to whatever problems your opponent seems to be giving you. So yeah, -3 to gain 2 life, which is, not huge, but to draw 2 cards, that is very good. Plus, he still has 2 loyalty left after that. So definitely not one of the worst Planeswalkers that these Planeswalker decks have spawned. So now that we've talked about him, let's move on to the deck itself, and we'll talk about the cards as well as what sort of the theme and idea behind the deck seems to be. Now, before we get into the main cards of the deck, let's just get the mana base out of the way. You do start off with 11 planes and then 11 islands, and then you're also going to get a play set of Meandering River. Now, this is going to enter the battlefield tapped, but you can tap it for either white or blue. This is very useful, obviously, in a multicolor deck. Not the most useful dual land ever out there, but it is a common one, and you do get 4 of them in this deck. And once again, this is not supposed to be a super powerhouse deck. It's supposed to be more of a fun deck, targeted mostly towards newer players. So that is the mana base that you can expect when you get one of these Planeswalker decks. Okay, now let's talk about the creatures in this deck as well as sort of the idea behind its construction. It seems to be a deck that is mostly built around getting in for damage through either evading your opponent's blockers, through flight, or simply creatures that are not going to be able to be blocked for either one reason or the other, as well as some tempo shifts, being able to bounce certain creatures back to your opponent's hand. There's also cards like this, the Sparring Construct, which is going to add counters to your creatures. So buffing up your creatures isn't necessarily the main part of this deck, but it is a component of this deck. So if you have a bunch of small flyers, obviously you're going to be able to start pecking away at your opponent if they have no way to block flying creatures. And it's cards like this which are going to be useful in augmenting those creatures and increasing the flow of damage towards your opponent. So in this deck, you do get 2 Sparring Constructs. Next up, you have Knight of New Benalia. I think that's pronounced correctly. It is a 3/1 for 1 and 1 white. Now, the 1 toughness to this creature is actually going to be important when it comes to other cards in this deck. So it may not seem like the best creature ever, but there is sort of a utility behind a 3/1 being included in this deck. Now, moving on from there, we have another 3-drop, which is Nyambi Faithful Healer. So for 1, a white and a blue, you get a 2/2 legendary creature, Human Cleric. Now, this is one of the cards which is exclusive to this deck. When Nyambi Faithful Healer enters the battlefield, you may search your library and or graveyard for a card named Teferi, Timebender, reveal it, and put it into your hand. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. This is a common theme in all the Planeswalker decks. There's going to be one card, whether it's a sorcery, artifact, or in this case, creature, which is going to tutor out the card or the Planeswalker, the main Planeswalker from this deck. Now, keep in mind of the wording of this, Teferi, Timebender, reveal it. So it is specific to that particular Planeswalker, not just any Planeswalker with the name Teferi. So this is very, very specific to the Planeswalker that comes with these decks. And without this ability, it's a 2/2 for 3 multicolored, which is not great, but because you can actually bring out your Planeswalker, it does have a lot of use in this deck. It's also a legendary creature, which is useful within the Dominaria set because there's a lot of other cards which sort of play off of legendary creatures. Now, you do get 2 copies of this, and keep in mind as well, too, it's not just useful for finding your Planeswalker if it's somewhere in your deck and you haven't been able to draw it yet. Because it says specifically or graveyard, It also means that if your planeswalkers hit the battlefield already, you can bring it back from your graveyard and get another chance to cast and get it on the board. This is important because you only get one copy of your planeswalker in your deck, but you do get a couple copies of this. And I just noticed there's a scratch on one of the cards right there, so that's great. I mean, not that this card's going to go shooting up in value or anything like that, but it's kind of nice not to get cards which come out of the box damaged. Speaking of which, there's damage to this card as well too, but we're going to try to overlook that and move on. Next up, we have Relic Hunter, which is a 2/1 for 1 and 1 blue. Relic Hunter can't be blocked if you've cast a historic spell this turn. Artifacts, legendaries, and sagas are historic. Now, this is what I was talking about as far as evasion goes. The deck is sort of built around with certain cards that can get past your opponent's blockers, regardless of how big they are or strong they are or whatever. This is going to, these creatures, types of creatures can slip by, get in that bit of extra damage. They're obviously not super hardy. They're not going to do a ton of damage because it's only a 2/1. They're not going to be very good blockers except for chumps. But the fact that they can slip by completely unhindered by your opponent, regardless of how many blockers they have up, is very important for the strategy of this deck, which is sort of like pecking away at your opponent to bring them down over time. So in this case, you're going to get 2 copies of this. Continuing on with the idea of blocking evasion, you have Tetsuko Mazawa, Fugitive. I, once again, no idea if I'm pronouncing any of these correctly. For 1 and 1 blue, you get a 1/3 legendary creature, Human Rogue. Creatures you control with power or toughness 1 or less can't be blocked. So as I mentioned before, with the Knight of New Benalia, the toughness on that creature, which was, if you remember, a 3/1, plays off with this particular card. So once again, evading the blockers from your opponents to be able to slip in for that important bit of damage, which could mean the game. So next you have another creature, which is another form of blocking evasion. It is an Aether Glider. Aether Glider, sure, we're going to go with that. For 3 of whatever, you get a 2/1 artifact creature bird construct, which has flying, but it can't block. Not that that really matters, because this, once again, is with the theme of the deck where you want to try to slip in damage with your opponent. So it's, to a certain degree, I guess you could call this like an aggro deck, in the sense that you're not really sort of the mind to be doing a whole lot of blocking, at least not a lot of successful blocking or non-chump blocking. So because it's got flying, a lot of the times, unless your opponent is playing a flying deck, these are the types of creatures that can keep slipping in without any hindrance from your opponent. So we get 3 copies of that. And another flyer here is Jayora's Familiar. For 4, you get a 2/2. So once again, the cost is not necessarily great based on the body of the creature you get, but this is an artifact bird creature. It's got flying, and historic spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So this is very useful to getting artifacts, legendaries, and saga cards, not that there's any sagas in this particular deck, out for a bit cheaper. So there are, as you have already seen, legendary creatures and other artifacts in this deck. So this is a useful sort of discount tool for being able to get those out a bit earlier, flood the board, and hopefully swing in for a bunch of unblockable damage. So you get 2 of those. Next up, you have a Juggernaut. Now, this is really a sort of punch-through, devil-may-care type card. For 4, you get a 5/3 artifact creature Juggernaut. It attacks each combat if able, and it can't be blocked by walls. You don't see a whole lot of walls anymore. This is a card from way back in the day, so this is really just about mindless aggression, putting this on the board. You know it's going to be swinging in. Your opponent is either going to have to let damage through. Most likely, they won't have something that can block this and survive. Probably at the worst case scenario is you'll be looking at a trade, the Juggernaut for one of their creatures. But a lot of the time, you're going to be able to destroy a chumper, like a 2/2 creature, for example, and the Juggernaut will still survive in the end. So yeah, this is really just about hitting the board and just constantly trying to hammer in your opponent and have them make the unfortunate choice of removing one of their creatures to chump block it. So you're going to get, I believe, 2 copies of this? Yes, 2 copies. Next up, we have a rare Daring Archaeologist, which is a 4-drop, 3 and 1 white, gets you a 3/3 Human Artificer. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Whenever you cast a historic spell, put a 1/1 counter on Daring Archaeologist. So this is that much smaller theme within this deck where you'll have ways of pumping up your creatures slowly over time. Because there are a lot of historic spells in this deck, the trigger for getting a 1/1 counter on this is going to go off more often than you might think. And when it enters the battlefield, you may also return an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. So you're almost guaranteed to have one of those types of cards in your hand after you cast this card. So it's useful in the sense that it gives you some graveyard recursion, and it also is useful in the sense that a lot of cards are going to play off this and give this +1/+1 counters. You do only get one copy of this card in the deck, though. Next up, you have Teferi's Sentinel. This, once again, is one of the cards which is exclusive to this deck, and it is a typical card when it comes to Planeswalker decks in the sense that it gets better depending on if you have your Planeswalker out on the field. Teferi Sentinel is a 2/6 for 5. It's a artifact creature golem, and as long as you control a Teferi Planeswalker, keep in mind that is just a Teferi Planeswalker, not specific to the Teferi Timebender. It is whatever Teferi Planeswalker you may have on the board. Teferi Sentinel gets +4/+0. So if you do have a Teferi Planeswalker out there, it is instead a 6/6, which for 5 is not horrible. It's certainly not horrible. And because it's a artifact, it's going to be considered a historic spell, so it's going to play off a bunch of other cards in the deck as well. And you are going to get 3 copies of that. Now, next up is a card which has a special sort of sentimental feeling when I see it. It's Sierra Angel. Now, for 3 and 2 white, you get a 4/4 flying creature with vigilance. It is a angel, obviously from the name. The reason why this has sort of like sentimental value to me is this is the very first, card used to be rare. This is the very first rare card I ever opened up in a pack of Magic the Gathering back when I was just a wee lad and I was experiencing the game for the first time. So I think I may actually still have that original Sierra Angel, which is, seen some play and it's a bit ragged around the edges, but having this back in a regular set, kind of warms my heart from a nostalgia standpoint. It's obviously not the best creature you can get for 5 anymore. They kept upping the game over the years, but it's not a bad card by any means. A 4/4 flyer with vigilance is still pretty good. Also, going along with the theme of the set, it is a flyer and with vigilance as well too. It's one of those cards which has a certain type of blocking evasion and will swing in for a bit of damage to your opponent. And then to finish things up with the creatures, we have Zahid, Djinn of the Lamp. For 4 and 2 blue, you get a 5/6 legendary creature Djinn. It's got flying. You may pay 3 and 1 blue and tap an untapped artifact you control rather than paying the spell's mana cost. Now, given how the rest of the deck is built, it is very likely that you have that discount available to you. Now, in the form of something like the Familiar as well too, historic spells cost you 1 less to cast. So if this is on the board, you could tap this, and then instead of paying 3 and 1 blue, you'd pay 2 and 1 blue. So it is possible to get this on the battlefield for just 3 mana, which would be the best case scenario. I don't know how likely it's going to be, but that is sort of like the dream if you end up having this card in hand and you've been able to also have one of the familiars on the board. So once again, it's another example of one with it being a flyer, of blocking evasion, and also a card that plays well off of the other cards in this deck. Now moving on, let's talk about the sorceries and instants that you'll find in this deck. Now to start things off, we have Gideon's Reproach. For 1 and 1 white, you have an instant, and it deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. From experience with the previous Planeswalker decks, removal is basically king, especially if you're pitted against another Planeswalker deck. So decks that have a decent amount of removal in them seem to do better than decks that don't. So it's important to have a card like this. It's not unconditional removal, obviously. The creature attacking has to have toughness of 4 or less, but it's still good because it's instant speed and it doesn't cost you much. So you can hold back just a little bit of mana and hopefully be able to surprise your opponent, whether they decide to block or if they're attacking. So once again, removal, very, very important in these decks. And you're going to get 3 copies of that. Then you have Befuddle. For 2 and 1 blue, it's an instant. Target creature gets -4/-0 until the end of turn. Draw a card. Now, this is one of those sort of like sneaky surprise cards, which could actually have more of an impact in the game than you may think initially. If your opponent is swinging in for what they think is maybe even lethal, or if they are blocking a creature or you're blocking one of their creatures, this card can mean the difference between a unfavorable trade to all of a sudden your opponent chump blocking without realizing it, so that they're going to lose their creature and your creature is going to be staying alive. Like, for example, the Juggernaut swinging in. If you're able to play this card on the card that's going to be blocking the Juggernaut, chances are your Juggernaut is going to end up not dying at the end of the turn. Also, as well, too, it's card draw, which is important in any deck, really, for the most part. Being able to constantly fuel your hand with more and more cards is very important. It's not the only card draw in this deck, but any card that has card draw attached to it, especially if it's an instant speed card, is still pretty good. And the extra ability of the -4, -0 until the end of turn is nothing to sneeze at as well, too. Once again, it's not the best card out there, but it could be a surprising card for certain matchups when combat is going down and your opponent isn't necessarily expecting this card. Moving on, we have Divination, which basically does what it says on the tin. Draw 2 cards for 3 mana. Sorcery speed, obviously instant speed draw cards are better than sorcery speed draw cards, but a sorcery speed draw card is still better than no draw card at all. So this is going to fuel your hand, most likely, or hopefully anyways, at a point where you really need some extra cards in order to keep up with your opponent. There is only one copy of this card in the deck. Now we end up with a playset of a card which once again is exclusive to these Planeswalker decks, and it is Temporal Machinations. For 2 and 1 blue, you get a sorcery, return target creature to its owner's hand. If you control an artifact, draw a card. Bit more draw, as I've mentioned before, which is very important, but it's conditional. So return target creature to its owner's hand. That is usually quite good because it creates what they refer to as a tempo shift, meaning that if your opponent just tapped out their last turn to play like a 5-cost creature for 3 mana, you get to hopefully return it to their hand and draw a card. But even if you only return it to their hand, you basically negated their entire last turn, so it slows them down. So it's very important. It also is going to aid with sort of the idea behind this deck, which is being able to slip in a bunch of damage towards your opponent without them being able to block it. So this is a nice little surprise, which sadly cannot be sprung at any time given the fact that it's a sorcery, but it's also not too difficult to have an artifact on the board given the number of artifacts in this deck. So you should be able to draw a card more often than not when you cast this. There are, like I mentioned, 4 copies of this, and this is exclusive to the Planeswalker deck. So there you go, that is the breakdown of the Teferi Timebender deck. Now I haven't played with it yet, so I can't really talk too much about different ways to improve it from first-hand experience, but given the fact that it's blue, and given how I tend to like to play, I would definitely add in some counter spells. Now, there's not a ton of new counter spells in Dominaria, so you can still keep this standard legal and grab some counter spells from other sets that are currently legal, either from the Kaladesh sets or from the Ixalan sets. So right off the top of my head, that is one of the things that I would say maybe add a few counter spells, possibly a Glimmer of Genius or something in this deck as well too, to add a bit of card draw and sort of filter out what is coming out off the top of your deck. So once again, without actually playing the deck, that's the most base advice I could give right now when it comes to things you could possibly add to this. I'll try to do another video, or even when the Mana Cave is going off and we're actually battling it out, to talk a bit more about how you could augment this deck and possibly improve it. But for now, what we're going to do is move on to the 2 packs that came with the Planeswalker deck and open those up and see what we get inside. Okay, so here we are, pack 1. Open this sucker up. We're going to start off with a card which is already in the deck. I'm going to read off each of the cards because there are only 2 packs. So we have Befuddle here, Skirk Prospector, Sergeant at Arms, Cold Water Snapper, Krosan Druid, Drudge Sentinel, I almost said Drudge Skeleton, which is a completely different card, Mammoth Spider, the grown-up version of the giant spider, Feral Abomination, Baloth Gorger, Guardians of Kolios. I think that's how you pronounce that. I know that there's the Caves of Kolios, and maybe I've been pronouncing that wrong all this time. Our first uncommon, which is sometimes difficult to tell, especially when you were looking at previews on Twitter. It was difficult to tell sometimes whether or not it was a common or uncommon, but this is the first uncommon, and it is Cast Down. Knight of Malice. Oh, and our rare is Rite of Belzenlock. Man, it's like they try to make it difficult for me to pronounce some of these things. For 2 and 2 black, you're going to get an enchantment Saga, The first and second act are create 2 0/1 black cleric creature tokens, and the third act is create a 6/6 black demon creature token with flying, trample, and at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice another creature. If you can't, this creature deals 6 damage to you. The descriptive text as far as what a saga is: as this saga enters the battlefield, after your draw step, add a lore counter, sacrifice after 3. So you play it, you put 1 lore counter on it. Just after your next draw step, you're going to put a second one, which is going to trigger this again. And then on the third act, you are going to trigger this, and then you're going to sacrifice the saga. So that's how sagas work. So it's not necessarily the greatest card that you can get in your rare spot, but it's not bad, and it's also kind of cool for me to have opened up the very first saga that I've ever had, because it's a brand new card type, and those don't come along too often anyways. And then we have a... See, okay, this is the thing. I was sure when I was doing this, but I didn't want to say anything. I was sure that there was only 2 uncommons before we got to the rare here. So I was thrown, because I was like, usually it's 3 uncommons and a rare. So when this came out, I was a little bamboozled by that. But we're going to bury the lead here and talk about the last uncommon in this pack, which is Garna the Bloodflame for 3, a black and a red. Get a legendary creature, because there's tons. This set is filthy with legendary creatures. And it's a 3/3 human warrior with flash. And when it enters the battlefield, return to your hand all creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from anywhere this turn. Other creatures you control have haste. So it's actually, I would actually probably pick this over this, really, when it comes to, you know, if I was doing this, picking these in a draft, I would probably actually go with this uncommon. So in that sense, it's kind of good that they were out of order, and this was the last card to be shown. And then we have a forest and a sapperling token. So there we go. Now, actually, I do want to mention, while we're talking about tokens, I have started a Token of the Month club where there are some exclusive tokens that are being created, or that have been created, for Brain Pulp TV. The first token for that is a Goblin token. Next month is going to be a Zombie token. So each month there's going to be new tokens, and I will mail them right to your door. So I will provide a link on this video as well in the description, where you guys can look up more information on that. Anyways, that is it for this pack. Let's move on to the next pack, and I promise I will not plug the Token of the Month Club again in this video. Okay, so here we go. One last pack with Teferi on the front of the pack. As I mentioned before, I will read them all off because there is only 2 packs in there. We've got Invoke the Divine, Opt, which is a card I really like. Get to Journeyman. Or sorry, get to Journey Mage, not Journey Man. Excavation Elephant. Elephant? Good lord, is it late. Excavation Elephant. Now that's a word I do know how to pronounce, and I just still butchered it. Anyways, Stronghold Confessor. Pierce the Sky. Divest, which I think is a card which I will be picking in a few drafts if I am going to be playing black. I think it's a very useful card along the lines of like Duress and those cards, so I quite like it for, you know, despite the fact that it's just a common. Grow from the Ashes. Yavimaya. Yavimaya. Oh, brother. Yavimaya Sapherd. Keldon Overseer. Our first uncommon is Urza's Tome. We have Sanctum Spirit. Now let's see if the next card is going to be the third uncommon, or if they're going to trip me up and have it be the rare again. It is the rare. Is that just how they're doing it now? Or are these packs just packed weird? Anyways, we have Two-Headed Giant. For 2 and 2 red, you get a 4/4 Giant Warrior. Whenever Two-Headed Giant attacks, flip 2 coins. If both coins come up heads, Two-Headed Giant gains double strike until the end of turn. If both coins come up tails, Two-Headed Giant gains menace until the end of turn. I have to admit, I've got a huge soft spot for coin flip cards. What's his name? Gracchus Thumb or whatever, that card which allows you to flip multiple times. I have a playset of that card because I like building decks around the coin flip mechanic. I know it's not a smart thing to do or makes for super powerful decks, but for some reason I've always been drawn to that particular mechanic when it comes to Magic. Now, I'm guessing, now that I've had some time to sort of think about it as I've been yammering on, this is going to be a legendary creature, right? Yeah, okay. So I'm guessing the way they're packing these booster packs now is that there's going to be the rare, and it's going to be followed by a guaranteed legendary creature at the uncommon rarity. So that is probably why they're done this way. I'm sure that is, and someone's probably already mentioned that in the comment section below, so thank you for, for explaining that to me, even though I did come to the conclusion eventually on my own. So we have Quendi, Pride of Femeref. These names drive me crazy sometimes because I can see them coming up in my head, and it's just, I cringe when I have to try to pronounce them properly. For 3 and 1 white, you get a 2/2 legendary creature, Human Knight. It's got double strike. Creatures you control with first strike have double strike. So it could be interesting in the right deck. And then we have a mountain and another Sapperling token. So there you guys go. That is what you can expect to find in one of these Planeswalker decks. Now, obviously, your mileage will vary when it comes to opening up the booster packs and the rares you will find, or possibly mythics. I have had some pretty good luck with some of these in the past when it comes to the rares and the booster packs. Not so much this time, but still, I always enjoyed his opening cards, and I learned something new when it came to these packs, is that the rare card is not going to be the last card shown. So I will know that going on from this video. However, that is it for this video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave that in the comment section below. As well, too, let me know what you thought about me giving some extra explanation and thought behind the construction of the decks. That's something that people have been asking for in previous videos in the comment section, so I wanted to try to implement it this time. It's the first time I've done it. I'm going to be doing the same thing when I open up the Chandra Planeswalker deck a few minutes from now. So please let me know what you guys think, yay or nay on that, maybe in the future, or if you just want to simply see what cards are in the deck. I'm all ears, always open to feedback, so let me know if you guys have thoughts one way or the other. And now with all that said, take care everyone. Thank you so much for watching, liking, subscribing, doing everything you guys do to support the channel. It means a lot to me. Have a wonderful day, night, morning, evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. May all your pulls be mythics, and I'll see you all again very soon.